Self-hosting services is really cool. You get to pick the hardware, software, maintenance schedule, and it gives you something to talk about in any social situation. However, there is a downside. Servers break, networks go down, and if that happens, then no one can access your website and see that super important blog post that people have been dying to read. Luckily, we have a solution for that. Today, we're going to be setting up a cloud virtual private server not only to function as a backup for our documents website, but to also function as a load balancer so that we can control the traffic between our home network and services hosted in the cloud. The goal for today is pretty simple. I have a documents website that I'm self-hosting within my home network, but if my home network goes down or something happens, I want it to default over to that cloud VPS and run it as a backup, and I want all this to run automatically. That's where the load balancer comes in. We'll actually be walking through the guide that I created specifically for this on my documents website. Go figure. Now going into this, there are some prerequisites. This assumes that you already have some self-hosted services, and I've done a couple of videos on getting that set up. So if you want to watch one of those, go check it out. I'll link one listed up here. And you're also going to need a DNS provider. I'm using Cloudflare. You can use something else like DigitalOcean or whatever, but make sure that you have something set up. And the last thing is a cloud VPS subscription. I'm using Database Smart, which they reached out to me and asked if I'd try out their services. So I am. Link down in the description below if you want to check them out. I'm using the $9 a month Nginx VPS. It gives me 4 gigabytes of RAM, 2 CPU cores, 100 gigabytes of SSD, and 100 megabits per second of networking and my own dedicated IP. So feel free to check them out in the link below. I'm using them for now and they seem pretty good. If the link's not there anymore, then I'm not using them anymore. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's my simple diagram. The connection is going to come in through the internet. It's going to go through Cloudflare's DNS directly to our cloud VPS, which is running an Nginx load balancer. From there, it will try to connect to my home lab. If that fails, then it will run backup on itself. Sounded weird. It will use itself as a backup. So if you have all the prerequisites that I listed before, let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is SSH into your VPS, and I've done that here. Check it out. It's a Linux VPS. I'm running Ubuntu server. You can run essentially whatever you want. Nginx can run on almost everything, but for these purposes, I'm running Ubuntu server. So the first thing we're going to install is Nginx, which will function as our load balancer. And luckily, since I'm running Ubuntu, it's extremely easy to install. You'll just run sudo apt install Nginx, and assuming you know your password, bada bing, bada boom, it will be installed. I've already installed it, obviously, but yeah, it's that easy. Then you'll want to make sure that it runs on startup, so you use systemctl enable Nginx, and now it will start on boot. And like I said, we want to use Nginx as the load balancer, so what we're going to do is actually create a load balancer configuration file. All the commands and all the files that I'm referencing are listed in this documentation site, so let's go ahead and copy this. I'm using Nano, but if you're some type of alpha male Chad Vim user, then go ahead and do that. But we're going to paste that in there, and you can see that I already have a file here. You won't when you first install Nginx, so don't worry, it's the same command, it'll just create one. But here you can see the file that I have. Let's walk through it because obviously I have to explain this. Let's zoom in a bit here. All right. So the top section here, upstream backend, is essentially the object that controls how the load balancer is going to function and what servers it's going to point to. So the first line here says least con, and that's essentially the mode you want the load balancer to function in. There are a couple. There's least connection mode, there's round robin, there's a couple, but least connection is pretty popular, and you'll see when I explain in a bit, it doesn't really matter for this scenario. Next, you'll list the servers that you want to load balance on. And here you can see we have 2. The first one being my home IP address where all my self-hosted stuff is hosted. And then you can see the second one, we're actually using localhost because we're running the load balancer on the same exact server that we're actually using to host the backup services. If you have a specific server running as your load balancer and a separate one as your backup, you'll obviously put the IP of the backup server that's running your services here. So yep, 2 servers, and you can see in the second one that I've also listed it as a backup. This is very important. What this means is that it will only use this server if all of the other servers in the load balancer are down. And you can see we only have 1, so if that one's down, use the backup. And that's why this least con load balancing mode doesn't really matter, because there's only 1 server that it's using, not counting the backup. We'll come back to this file later, so if I skip over some things, I'm probably coming back to explain them, don't worry. Next, you'll have your server object, and here you can see we're listening on port 443 using SSL, so nobody steals your anime. Next, you have server name, which is essentially the domain you will be using to route all your traffic through using DNS. Next, we have some parameters. SSL on, I'm pretty sure this isn't needed anymore. This is probably depreciated, I'm pretty sure, but I have it in there, it's not hurting anything. SSL certificate and certificate key. We'll get back to this later, I promise, but this is set up through Certbot, which is essentially creating and managing our certificates for us so that we can have proper TLS SSL encryption. And then location, these are just some parameters that I pasted in here from the default Nginx guide. You can leave them in here. The only thing I changed is that we are using HTTPS instead of HTTP, and then the name of our upstream, which we name backend, you can name it whatever. So that's it. That is all we need to set up to run a functioning load balancer. So once you do that, save it, Control O, and then Control C. No, I lied, Control O, then Control X. Then you can restart Nginx. And just like that, we have our load balancer running, but there is a lot more to do, so let's keep going. Next step is to install Certbot. Like I said, Certbot's going to be managing our SSL certificates so that we can have proper encryption, because you definitely don't want to host things using HTTP with 0 encryption, because then you're just exposing everything and you really don't want that. So first thing you'll do is install Certbot with this command. What that's going to do is install the base Certbot service and essentially allow you to create certificates, although they will be self-signed. We're going to take that a step further and install a plugin based on our DNS provider, which is Cloudflare. And they actually have quite a few that you can use. You can see they have Cloudflare, DigitalOcean, DNS Simple or DNS Simple, Linode, quite a few here that are supported. But we're using Cloudflare, so you can go in and check out the kind of small documentation page on it. Shows you examples, kind of explains how it works, but let's go back and walk through my guide. And once we have Certbot installed, we'll actually have to install the specific plugin for our DNS. You can see install Python 3 Certbot DNS Cloudflare, and that will change depending on which provider you're using. If you're using DigitalOcean, use DigitalOcean. And then we're going to need to supply some credentials, because what this is doing is saying, well, we're going to go a step further. We're not going to create self-signed certificates. We're actually going to contact the DNS provider and make sure that we're getting specific certificates for the DNS that you want to use. So that just makes it a lot easier, and it's going to manage it for us. And what we're going to do is create a credentials file. You can store it really anywhere. We're just going to use this for reference. So you can create it in the home directory like I did, nano certbotcreds.ini. It's going to create a file, and you're going to use 2 lines. That's all you need. If you're doing it with Cloudflare, you might need 3 lines if you're using it with something else. But so let's copy that command. Go over here, and you can see my credentials here, and they're obviously blurred out, but the top one is going to be your Cloudflare API key. If you want to know more about Cloudflare API keys versus API tokens, I have an entire video on how to set up self-hosting sites using Cloudflare DNS, linked up here. Might be the same video that I talked about earlier, but oh well. So that's all you need, the global API key and your email. Again, Control O, Control X. All right, once we have that INI file, we're actually going to create the certificates using the Certbot application. And that's going to be just as easy as copying this command, but you will have to change some things. Don't copy this verbatim. Here you can see we're running the Certbot. We're specifying DNS Cloudflare as our plugin. We are specifying the Certbot credentials INI file that we just created. And then we are specifying our domain. So here you would just replace obviously your domain with your domain. And I'm using wildcard certificates. You don't have to do that. If you have a specific subdomain that you want to use, obviously specified here, but For my purposes, I'm just using a wildcard certificate. So once you run that, you'll see an output like this. And the important things to note are the certificate file here and the key file here. And if you remember earlier, when we were setting up the load balancer, I had my certificate and key files listed there. This is where we are pulling them from. So take these locations and use those in your load balancing configuration file for Nginx. All right, keep on keeping on. Next step is to install Nginx Proxy Manager. And you don't have to use Nginx Proxy Manager if you don't want. You can use some other reverse proxy software, but I've found that Nginx Proxy Manager is extremely easy to set up and it's worked for me, so I continue to use it. This is going to ensure that the traffic coming into our VPS is actually going to be routed to the appropriate service. And you can use whatever guide you want to set up Nginx Proxy Manager, but if you want to follow mine, here it is. Now I run a lot of things in Docker, so I actually have Docker installed on my VPS already and also Portainer. So I'm going to use Docker to install Nginx Proxy Manager. You don't have to go with Docker, but again, I use it, so that's what my guide has. So here you can see my Portainer instance running on my VPS. And if we go into templates, I've just created a custom template for Nginx Proxy Manager, which is using Docker Compose. It is very, very simple. Just specify an image and essentially the ports that you want to use. You don't have to use these exact ports. These are just the ones that I've chosen. And if you notice from my configuration file before, I'm actually sending traffic to 40443 on the backup server because that is where Nginx Proxy Manager is being hosted from. So go ahead and spin that up. If you did it correctly, you'll have Nginx Proxy Manager up and running, and theoretically you should be able to access it. So if we go to your VPS IP, I've created a local DNS record. That's why you keep seeing me type in cloudowl.com. It's so that I don't have to type in the actual IP and have to worry about you guys knowing it and being annoying and trying to hack me like a bunch of jerks. And then you're going to use the port that you forwarded for 81. In my case, it's 40,081. And just like that, you'll be put into your Nginx Proxy Manager dashboard. So yes, we are in the dashboard. Next thing is that we're going to have to configure this in Nginx Proxy Manager. So we need Nginx Proxy Manager to know when we get this specific request in from the outside world, route it to this service locally. And I have a video on specifically using Nginx Proxy Manager. Yep, you guessed it, linked right here. But let's walk through it just in case. So Nginx Proxy Manager, the first thing you're going to want to do is set up SSL certificates. Go in here, you can see I've already created one. So let's jump in here. Obviously you're going to add one, but I've already done that. So let's take a look at it. I guess I can't, hello? Can't just like look at it. So go to add certificate. Let's Encrypt, an email address for your Let's Encrypt account. This can be whatever. The domain names, remember we used wildcard certificates. So again, I'm going to use that here. Then down here, you're going to say use a DNS challenge and select your DNS provider here. Again, depends on which DNS provider you use. We are using Cloudflare. And what it's going to ask for is your API token. This is different from the global API key that we used earlier. Now, the documentation for Certbot says that you can use the token, but when I tried to do it, it didn't work. That's why I'm using the global API key with Certbot and then the token here. So this is going to ask for your global API token. I have a link in my guide on how to set up one in Cloudflare. It's like 3 clicks, don't worry. Once you have that, paste it down here, agree to the terms, basically giving your firstborn child over to the Nginx overlords, and then click save. And once you do that, it's going to take a minute or two. And once it's complete, you will have an SSL cert ready to go. Now we can actually route the traffic. Let's go back to hosts. Go to proxy hosts, and here you can see I already have one. Let's poke around and take a look at it. And the first thing you're going to want to do is again go over to SSL and make sure that you select the certificate that we just created. And go back to details, specify the domain name. So we're doing a backup of my site, which is located at radowl.hostyboy.com. So that's the domain we're using. It's hosted on port 8080. This will be different depending on what service you're hosting. You'll just type in the IP and the port. This is my VPS IP address. I tried it with localhost since we're on the same server, but it didn't really like that. So I just used the actual VPS IP address. And that's it. Save. And just like that, we are essentially set up and done. And the actual final thing is to make sure your DNS records are correct. And this will be different depending on which provider you're using. I'm using Cloudflare. Whatever you're using, it might be slightly different, but just go in there and make sure that your A record for your domain is pointed to your VPS, because that is where our load balancer is hosted, and that is where our load balancer is going to point to either our home network or back to itself for backup services. So that is it. Everything should be working. Let's go back into the load balancer configuration file just so that I can explain it. Just explain it. Talking is freaking hard, man. So if we go back into here, let's take a look at our load balancer. And now this will probably make more sense to you. So walking through it again, our main server is our home server, going to 443. And then our backup is on localhost 4043. Now remember 4043. 40,443, I should have picked an easier port, is the port we're using for Nginx Proxy Manager. This will be different depending on which one you use. We're listening on 443 for HTTPS. This is the domain name we're using. And remember, these were the certificates and key files that were created when we installed and ran Certbot. So everything should make sense. Everything should work. If my network goes down, it's automatically failed over to the backup server, which will run through Nginx Proxy Manager and route me to my backup server. So that's it. Everything is set up and working. From the outside world, it will connect through Cloudflare DNS. We have our A record pointed directly to our Cloud VPS server, which is running Nginx Load Balancer. And what it's going to do is perform health checks on our primary server, or servers if you're using multiple. If those servers are healthy, it will route traffic to our home lab and function as normally. If it fails a health check and everything is down, it will use the backup server, which is itself, and essentially host our services from there. So this will look different depending on your use case. I have one server in my home network and one server as a backup. You may have a completely different configuration. You may want the Cloud VPS to function as your primary and your home as your secondary. Go ahead and do that. You can alter the steps that I took to easily have that configured. But yeah, that's all cool, but I'm sure you guys want to see that work. All this talking, let's make sure that it's actually doing what we want it to. All right, so here you can see our website works. It is accessible to the outside world, but I actually haven't updated it on my backup server in a while. So if this goes down and it routes automatically, then the website should be up, but I don't think you'll see this Cloudflare tunnel setup guide that I just wrote the other day because I haven't pushed that to the backup server yet, and that's for another video. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna simulate that by essentially changing my load balancer config file and slightly changing the IP of my home address, which essentially means it's going to fail a health check, which simulates my network going down. So let's change it by one character. Yes, we're saving. Yep. Yes, we're writing. Oh, okay, let's try that again. And we're gonna restart Nginx. And just like that, should be performing health checks, should fail over to our Cloud VPS, which should have a different version of my website. Now, I assume this is cached. Let's go ahead. Let's open up Mozilla. We'll use Edge, which I know shouldn't have this cached. And would you look at that? raidowl.hostyboy.com up and running with our old, completely wrong guides and test guides in here, clearly running on my backup server. And just like that, raidowl.hostyboy.com still available, yet running on my backup server, automatically switched over using Nginx Load Balancer. Pretty cool, pretty useful. I've been wanting to do this for a while now, so I'm glad that I actually have this set up. The next step, obviously, is to make sure that my services between my home network and my Cloud VPS are actually in sync, because while this is cool, it isn't practical that my backup is a different version than my production one. So be ready for a future video. So subscribe to make sure that you're around when I do that. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you did, drop a like. Let me know down in the comments how you're running failover and load balancing in your setup. And if you like content like this, then please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out a ton. But yeah, that is it. I have the guide posted and up on my website, which as a backup now. That guide is listed down in the description below. I want to give a huge shout out to all my YouTube members and my Patreons. You guys are my self-hosted services with cloud backups and proper failover. Okay, that one was kind of weird, but you get it. But that's it. If you're still around, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.